into a new chapter here today. You know, one of the strangest phenomenons I think that we can experience in this life, it's just weird, is deja vu. You ever had deja vu? Like, it's just so weird. Sometimes I have had deja vu so bad that I'm like, if I could harness this power, I could predict the future, right? Like, you're so convinced that you had experienced this brand new situation before. It's happening in real time, but you're like, this has happened before. I just can't remember when I knew this or how. Right? Deja vu is so weird, and I bet you everybody in here has had one of those experiences that you felt like that before. And this morning might be another one of those experiences, because I am preaching over a passage in Mark that you're going to feel like, if you've been coming during this series, you've already heard this before. You've heard this moment before. This is a moment in which Jesus has been preaching to the multitudes, to thousands, tens of thousands of people, and they are getting hungry, because evidently he preaches longer than I do. And they're there, and he's having compassion upon them, and they're in a desolate place, and there's no food. What are we going to do? And then some loaves and fish are there, but just a little bit, and he takes that and miraculously multiplies the food available, and everyone eats. They're stuffed. They gorge on bread and fish, and there's even leftovers. You might be thinking, did we not just study this moment? Well, 6 sermons ago, we did study a moment similar to this. In Mark chapter 6, we see that Jesus fed the 5,000 and their families, but now he is feeding the 4,000 and their families, because this miracle has happened more than once. Just like other sign miracles, I mean, you think Jesus healed the paralytic. Well, that's not the only paralytic that he healed. Jesus healed a blind person. Well, that's not the only blind person that he healed. We read in the 4 Gospels that several of these sign miracles happen more than once. And this is another situation in which this miracle of feeding the multitudes happens more than once. And so this miracle is meant to be understood. It's why the Gospels sometimes, well, especially in John, they're referred to as signs. Signs are meant to be read. We're going to study this sign again, and I'm going to argue that it has additional information with regard to it. So let's jump into Mark chapter 8, and let's just take the first 3 verses to get into this text. It said, "In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, 'I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have had nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some have come from far away.'" So again, here we go again. The crowd has gathered. They've been with Jesus, listening to him teach. Now, some critics of the Bible, they're going to say, no, when they were copying the Bible down, they accidentally recorded this miracle twice. This is actually the same moment just being recorded again. But whenever you get into the details, you notice there's some difference that make it obvious that this is a second time. This same miracle is happening a second time. It's in a different location, a different place on the map. This is in Gentile territory. The last time he fed the multitudes, he was in a heavily Jewish populated area. But what's been happening recently in the Gospel of Mark? He's been in heavily Gentile populated areas. He goes to these Gentile areas to get away from the crowds, but when he goes there, he ends up showing compassion to them just like he does the Jewish people. But if we see in this moment, there's a different amount of people, there's a different amount of bread, there's a different amount of fish, there's a different amount of leftovers. Mark and Matthew both record both times. So Mark is not the only gospel that has both of these moments recorded. And of course, most obvious when we get to verses 19 through 20, Jesus is going to talk about both times that he fed the multitudes. And so when you're looking in the text, it's very easy to see this is not the same thing being recorded twice. This is the same miracle that happened more than once, but not the same moment. And there's a big lesson here. A big lesson that I think you and I probably, we're just not going to appreciate this lesson as much as they're going to appreciate it in the first century. But you got to realize, being in Gentile territory and doing miracles and preaching the gospel there, this would have blown their minds. We're so used to, we are Gentiles. We're so used to the gospel being preached in Gentile territory because we're in Gentile territory preaching the gospel here, right? But in that time, these disciples who were Jewish, they've grown up their entire lives learning about God's love for his chosen people, Israel. So they've learned about God's love for them. They haven't been learning so much about God's love for the rest of the world. And so now we see that takes place oftentimes in the Old Testament, that not just Jewish people are incorporated into the love of God, but for someone who was a Jew in the first century, they would have learned all about Israel as God's chosen people. And so to have a category for the Gentiles to be incorporated into this in such a major way with the Messiah, it would have blown their minds. So Jesus is taking his disciples into Gentile territory, showing them compassion, preaching them the gospel, and doing miracles in Gentile territory to teach them and to prepare them for a future ministry, because his kingdom is expanding beyond Israel. The love that God has for his people is going to expand beyond the Jews, and he's preparing them for this moment. And so when Jesus later, when he resurrects and says to them, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations," he could have added there, "like I've already been showing you, like we've been doing whenever you follow me around and I preach and do miracles, like we've already been in Gentile territory. Keep doing that." And so he's putting his compassion on display when he's doing the same miracle that he did for the Jews for the Gentiles here in Mark chapter 8. And did you notice that the crowd that was listening to him teach, they had been there for 3 days? That's some dynamic teaching, folks. If you can keep the crowd for 3 days, you're on fire, right? Here in 30 minutes, you'll be thinking, is Las Trancas still going to be there? We got to get out of here. But they're listening to Jesus, and they're ready to go for 3 days without food. They're starving, but they're so captivated by what Jesus is teaching that they're just locked in. I'm going to guess he was a better speaker than me. Probably a little more important, right? They're skipping meals to hear Jesus preach. It's a good reason. He's so worried about them. He's been preaching for so long, and they've had so little food while they've been listening to him preach. He's like, if we send them away right now, they're going to faint. I've never been worried about that with you guys. Never been worried about anybody fainting leaving here because they're so hungry, despite how dramatic we can be sometimes leaving church. Let's continue in verse 4. It says, "And his disciples answered him, 'How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?'" Isn't that a funny question to hear them say? If this is the second time he has fed the multitudes with just a little bit of food, why are they asking this question? How are we gonna feed all these people? All right, I better send them away, but man, if I send them away, they're gonna faint. And the disciples are like, what are we gonna do? What do you mean, what are we gonna do? You could feed them again, right? Shouldn't they just presume that Jesus is this miraculous vending machine? Do it again, Jesus. Well, you know what to do. Come on, they're hungry. Crank out some bread and fish. Let's go. They don't do that, do they? They don't take that posture with Jesus. Now, some people do take that posture with Jesus in the New Testament. Who are they? They're the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They're demanding miracles. They expect Jesus to do a miracle when they want a miracle. When they see a need, they expect Jesus to just jump and meet that need in just the way that they want, in their timing, and they want that to go down like that. But, true believers in Scripture, they don't do that. They don't do that. They certainly believe that Jesus can do it. They've seen him do it. But they don't presume that he's going to do it. They don't demand that he does it. And so I think there's a little lesson probably to take note of there, right? I mean, people that have that posture today within Christianity, right? They declare that God's going to do this miracle. They demand from God that he should do a miracle. True believers aren't to take that posture with Jesus, or they don't take that posture with Jesus in the New Testament. So what's going on here? Why are they asking this? Why are they asking, how can we feed these people in this desolate place? Is it a rhetorical question? I don't know. When I try to read it in a rhetorical way, it kind of seems silly to me. how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? Jesus? It's just, I can't do it. I just don't think that's how it went down. It's a possibility, I suppose. Here's what I think is going down. This is a miracle that Jesus does more than once, but he doesn't do all the time. You got to understand that, like when Jesus healed a lame man, for example, he would have passed hundreds of lame people, hundreds of paralytics, but he chose to heal some of them. He would have come into contact with a lot of people with various diseases, and he healed people with various diseases, but he didn't heal all of them. He healed a lot of blind people, a lot of deaf people, but did he heal all of them? No. And so every time there's a need, it doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus is going to do a sign miracle every single time. And so no doubt by this point in time, this is at the peak of popularity for Jesus' ministry. They have been with Jesus before hundreds and even thousands of people a ton of times. But he's only fed the multitudes once so far. But they've been with those crowds, and they've been hungry crowds several times. And so they already know, well, he doesn't always do this. We're not going to presume that he's going to do it every single time a crowd gathers. We're not going to expect or even prod Jesus into doing this just because we want this to be done, right? So they respect Jesus, but they probably lit up when he says what he says next. And this is another thing too. Whenever you're thinking about miracles in the New Testament, especially when Jesus and his disciples are traveling and doing ministry, do you notice that the miracles are always unanticipated? They're wondrous. People are amazed. They marveled. They don't expect it to happen, but it does. And so that's part of what makes them so special, right? Well, regardless of how they ask that question, they know what's about to happen based on what Jesus is saying next. Let's pick up in verse 5. And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. Again, they probably know what's coming next, right? And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Okay, so this time is a little different, right? They had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish last time. This time, there are 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish. So you notice there's some differences here. Now, last time I was preaching over the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, I said fishes. Do you remember that? I caught myself, though. I said fishes, because fishes isn't a word, right? Wrong. It is a word. I've learned stuff since last time I preached over this. So after I preached that sermon and I said fishes on accident, I'm in line at TSC, right? And I'm checking out there and I see a brochure. And it says, Fishes of Ohio. Because when you refer to different species of fish, you are talking about fishes. Fact check me, look it up, your teacher lied to you. Thank you. And I took it a bit further because I will work really hard to vindicate myself. Whenever you look back in Mark 6, the first time he fed the multitudes, the fish there were described with the Greek word ichthus. It's a large fish, right? You know the ichthus, like the bumper stickers and the symbol for Christianity. Well, in Mark 8 here that we're studying, the few small fish, did you notice it says small fish? It's because it's a different Greek word. It's a different species. They're talking about sardines. So we are talking about fishes. It is fishes. I was right. It felt good to get that out. When I say something dumb, I will work overtime to redeem myself. But no, I was today years old when I discovered that, right? I mean, like, I thought fishes was not a word. Teacher lied to me. So kiddos, when you go to school and your teacher said fishes, says it's not a word, you stand up on your desk, you slam your Chromebook down, and you said, yes, it is. You say, yes, it is. It is a word. Don't slam the Chromebook. No, you have to pay for that. Okay. There's actually different too with the baskets. When you look at the Greek word, this is the stuff that fascinates me. So I know that some of you are like, I don't care, I don't speak Greek. Well, I just think this is interesting. If you notice that there's 7 baskets left over, of leftovers here. There were 12 baskets of leftover. Well, when they're in the Jewish populated areas, and remember, these signs teach us things. His provisions are sufficient for his people. There were 12 baskets of leftovers for the Jewish people because of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were small baskets, though, a different type of basket than what's spoken of here in Mark 8, which are large baskets, but there's fewer of them. It's 7 large baskets here in Mark chapter 8 of leftovers. And again, 7 is another perfect number. There's 7 days in a week, and it took 7 days in the story of creation. This is the perfect amount of leftovers. This sign is teaching us yet again that even for the Gentiles, his provisions are perfectly sufficient. Again, these are the details that I think about at night. And now you notice that there's a different amount of people here. In Mark chapter 8, we're told that there's 4,000 people. And it doesn't mention anything about their families. But always remember, when this is in multiple Gospels, you should read the account in both Gospels and compare them, because then you get all of the details, right? They're written from different perspectives. They remember different details. When you read in Matthew's Gospel about this account, we're told that there's 4,000 men plus their wives and kids. So just like in the multitude of the 5,000, we're talking about upwards of 10 to 20,000, because families were gigantic back in those days. So this is a massive, massive crowd. And when they get done, they get in a boat and they go back to Jewish territory. Dalmanutha, which is near Capernaum, which is kind of the base of operation in Jesus' earthly ministry. That's where Peter lived, and Jesus would stay there a lot of times and live there for a while. And so they're back in Jewish populated area. So what's going to happen? What are they going to do now? Well, when they come back to Jewish populated areas, one of two things happens, and we've already learned this in Mark's gospel. Either the multitudes are going to show up and they're ready to see a healing and they want to hear more teaching, or the opposition shows up. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes of the Pharisees, they'll show up and they're ready to debate. This is what Jesus from time to time just needs to get away from. And so this time when he comes back near Capernaum, the Pharisees are waiting on him to debate. What do they say? What's the debate about this time? Well, let's continue here in 11 through 13. We're going to go all the way through 21 today. It says, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him. Oh, exhausting arguments. Seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. He's like, I'm getting out of here. Now, in Matthew's account, it mentions that the Sadducees are there with the Pharisees. Who are the Sadducees, the Pharisees? These are different, like we think of all the different Christian denominations today. Well, back in that time, there were different sectors of Jewish doctrine and theology. And so they would line up on a lot of things, but then they would have some differences when it came to other things. And so the Sadducees and the Pharisees, normally, these guys hated each other. They would be debating with each other when they come in contact with each other. But now they have this perceived common enemy with Jesus. And so for a first century Jew to be reading this, thinking, well, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are hanging out to tag team and take on Jesus, this is crazy. They normally just can't stand to be around each other, or they'd be debating one another, not Jesus. But here, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they're waiting for Jesus, and they are ready to debate. They're demanding a sign. Show us a sign. Prove to us you're the Messiah. Do it, but prove it to us in our way. Now, what's happened up to this point in Mark? They've already seen a sign. They had already been witnessing signs. They had seen Jesus cast out demons. They had seen him heal people of diseases of various kinds. They have witnessed signs already. And what did they say when they actually witnessed the sign? They don't deny that the sign happened. They credit Satan for the power to do that sign. And so here they are again, like, Jesus knows how this is going to go. Oh, okay, you want to see a sign like last time, and then you tell everybody that I'm casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub? You want to do that song and dance again? No, thanks. We're not going to do that. Because you're just looking for something to discredit me. You're looking for something just to be an obstacle. You just want things with, in your timing, and you want to be the boss. You want things your way. You want to be the judge. But guess what? You're not the judge. So when Jesus encounters this debate again, he just sighs deeply in his spirit. It grieves him. You just want to be an obstacle. You're spiritually blind. And because you're spiritually blind, no sign will be given this generation. That's a really weird sentence to translate from the Greek to the English. That's actually not what it says. But because it's so difficult to translate, that's how the translators put it. No sign will be given this generation. Because the sentence that's actually there, that's what it means, but it's said in a peculiar way. We say things like this in English, but here's what it would literally translate to. It's a sentence fragment, but on purpose. He literally says, if a sign will be given this generation, and it's open-ended, there's no conclusion, but it's on purpose. You've seen this done on TV or heard people say this, why I oughta, and then nothing is said. When you leave it with no conclusion, you leave it up to someone's imagination, it intensifies what they're trying to say. Why I oughta. And so what he literally says here in this moment, if a sign be given this generation, he's saying, I'd rather die than do things your way. I'd rather die than give you a sign right now. He's so frustrated, he's so grieved by their posture and just their laser focus and trying to be an obstacle to his ministry that he's like basically saying, you're not going to get a sign. You're not going to get a sign out of me this way. And in Matthew's account, what does he say? The only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. As he's prophesying his death and resurrection, right? Just like Jonah was swallowed up in the well, and on the third day spit back out. He says this to them in a way that no doubt dumbfounds them. The only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. As in, I'm going to die, and on the third day I'm going to rise again. And that's going to be the only sign that you're able to see, because you're not going to get one out of me in your timing and your way. You're not the judge. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, what we see in the New Testament, they're spiritually blind. It's like they have eyes, but they don't see. It's like they have ears, but they don't hear. We hear that phrase over and over in the New Testament. And so he's grieved and he's exhausted by the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Well, what about the disciples? Because sometimes they're spiritually blind too. And we're getting ready to read in this paragraph a moment in which the disciples are putting their spiritual blindness on display. He responds differently to his disciples. He's been investing in them. He loves them. They're his students. He's training them. He's teaching them. But when they're spiritually blind, he wants to take time to teach them. And it gets pretty intense here. Here's how this sets up. They got back in the boat. They're going to the other side. They're getting away from the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And here's what happens. Look at verses 14 through 16. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. That's kind of funny, right? They had forgotten to bring bread. And they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. So, okay, keeping score again. 6 sermons ago, he feeds the multitude. He has 5 loaves of bread and manages to miraculously multiply that bread to feed like 20,000 people. And then it happens again in Gentile territory. They don't have enough bread, and he multiplies that bread, and it feeds 10, 15, maybe 20,000 people again. So they get in a boat, and they have the audacity to say, oh, shoot, I don't think we got enough bread. What are we going to do? And so he takes a moment to teach them. And at first, at least, he's patient with them. Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, right? You're going to be doubters like them too. Don't beware of behaving and thinking like they do. That's an infectious way to think. That doubting mentality, or you're going to be demanding signs and things like that. I mean, surely that's not what you're about to do. Oh, yes, they are, because it says, then as soon as he gets done saying that, oh, yeah, but seriously, we don't have enough bread. What are we going to do? We only got one loaf of bread. Remember, these loaves of bread, we think of a loaf of, like, Wonder Bread. This is, like, think crackers, the small loaf of bread. And so, someone's ESV is reading out loud. That's awesome. Okay. So as they begin, discuss. I lost my train of thought. Just kidding. So they begin discussing with one another, what are we going to do? So he sighs deeply. These are his disciples, though. I think he kind of loses his cool a little bit here. He's getting ready to rebuke them. He's had enough. He's had all he can take. He's going to put the hammer down. Have you ever read a moment in which Jesus is mad? Here's a moment. Check this out in 17 through 20. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, probably sheepishly, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" So he rebukes them in this moment. You got amnesia or something? You forget? Are you guys serious? You're worried about bread after everything you've witnessed? You are worried about bread right now? We read about the forgetfulness of the disciples, and we really want to come down hard on them. How could anyone be that spiritually blind, right? Because we see everything so clearly in our day, in our time, in our lives, right? Well, I kind of think that this moment, when we read about the forgetfulness of the disciples, I'm going to argue this is an incredibly familiar moment and feeling that the disciples are having. I think you and I can connect a lot to the disciples right here. Right? We look at their lives and they say, look at all the evidence, look at all the things, all the ways God has provided for them, and yet now they think God's not going to provide for them. Well, are we willing to ask ourselves the same question? How many of us today, like, your life is full of evidence of how much God has provided for you in abundance and in just countless ways, yet every time you come upon a new obstacle in life or something isn't panning out exactly the way you thought it should or hoped it would, and you think, now this time, God's not going to provide for me. This time the mountain's too high for God. This time things aren't going to pan out well. I'm going to choose, rather than trusting God and just going forward in that hope and trust that I have in Him, instead of that, I'm going to choose to worry. I'm going to choose to have just be anxious about every little detail that isn't exactly the way I want it to be. Isn't that familiar? That's familiar to me. I'm the pot calling the kettle black here. I am admitting full and well that that feeling is all too familiar to me, especially in the past few years, right? We're so prone to doubt, like the leaven of the Pharisees, the leaven of Herod. We're so prone to that leaven. We're so prone to think that way. It's infectious. Once you start thinking that way and start doubting, it seems to snowball. That way of thinking seems to get bigger and bigger and dominate your thoughts. It can spiral. And so Jesus, I believe, has this teaching here for us in the New Testament to warn us. Hey, watch out. Are you feeling like that? Is that feeling familiar to you? Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. It's a harsh rebuke to the disciples, but he's teaching his disciples how to combat the worry, how to fight back against that anxiety when it inevitably takes place in our fallen and broken lives. How does he teach them? In this harsh rebuke, how does he teach them to combat these feelings? Do you not remember? That's what he says. Do you not remember? Whenever we're talking about practicing Christianity, practicing our religion it's an exercise in remembering. That's what we do. We come here to remember. Like, if you want to have a strong faith, you want your faith to feel, nourished and true, you need to be a good rememberer. That may not be a word. I don't know about that one. You need to be a good rememberer. We're going to say it's a word today. And when you study about how God's people practice their faith and practice religion from Genesis to Revelation, what they're doing is gathering and doing things that cause them to remember. And so any Jewish festival that you read about the Passover. That was the big Jewish festival. Everybody had to come to celebrate the Passover. They were doing things in specific ways and in peculiar ways. When we read about all the different things they did in Passover, we think, why do they do all these different rituals and things? It's because every little detail was reminding them of a detail in the Old Testament, in the moment of Passover in Exodus. And so they came and did the Feast of Booths, and they did all these specific things to remember specific things that God has done in the past. And so if you want to strengthen your faith, you need to practice being a good rememberer, because we are prone to forget. When we wander from the faith, it's a process of forgetting. We're not remembering as well as what we were remembering. And so when we want to strengthen and bolster our faith, we need to get it in a routine of remembering. And so that's why we say, be disciplined in these certain areas of your life, or you're going to feel weak. Don't neglect gathering together and things like that, right? We read this all over the New Testament. You're feeling weak. Well, are you not remembering well? That's a great place to go to first if you are caught in a rut, or if you're stuck in a rut. If you're feeling weak, if you're feeling exhausted, if you're feeling like the leaven of the Pharisees and leaven of Herod is feeling way too familiar, take a look at the pattern that you're living in. Are you living in a pattern, in a rhythm of remembering? Are you remembering well? Are you talking about your faith? Are you hearing about the faith? This is how it's strengthened. When we go into communion, and some churches don't do communion every week, do they, right? Some do it once a month. Some do it every month with 5 Sundays in it. And we do it every week. A lot of churches do it every week. Well, yeah, we want to do it every week. That's what they do in the New Testament. But we want to keep remembering well. This is why it's so important to me. I want to keep remembering. It doesn't take long for me to get wrapped up in my daily life and all the problems of the world to start forgetting the gospel. And so when I come back to do communion, this ritualistic thing that we do, and reading scripture, or having a responsive reading together as a church family, singing about the gospel together, reading the Gospel of Mark and studying it together. I've read the Gospel of Mark before lots of times, but I want to read it again because I'm prone to forget it. I'm prone to forget all of these little details that we take time to go through and think about. And I go back and I study it all week, and I'm like, oh man, there's so much here. And just that process of remembering, it strengthens your faith. You will feel stronger. And when we take communion, what does Jesus say? This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, because we need to remember. When people say, why do you take communion so often? You should ask, why do you not take communion so often? There's a better question to ask. We want to remember. Why do you take communion so often? Because I'm prone to forget the gospel. I'm prone to forget it. I've been raised in the church. I've read the Gospels. I know the gospel. I study the gospel. I think about the gospel. I listen to sermons. But man, if I don't keep that as a part of as a pattern in the way that I live my life, I'll forget it. I'll wander from it. I'll feel weak. I'll feel like my faith is just barely hanging on, just by a thread. And a lot of people get in that place, and sometimes the answer just seems too simple, and so we don't do it. Oh, let me guess, Pastor, read the Bible and pray and go to church, and then I'll feel that everything that fixes it. Well, that's a great pattern to live in, to have strong faith. So, yeah, sometimes we don't go with that answer because it seems too simple. You've oversimplified this. My problems are complex. Well, we know your problems are complex. All of our problems are complex. And this gospel that we come back to each and every week, it's multifaceted. And it it nourishes us and it strengthens us in so many different ways that it equips us to live this life of chaos. It equips us to be able to handle it. It equips us to be able to walk through terrible circumstances still feeling strengthened and able to endure and persevere through those moments. So whether you are feeling strong or weak right now, we are welcoming you to the table to take communion, to remember, because no matter where you're at on that spectrum, you need to remember again. And so we're going to take that bread to remember the life of Christ that was lived for us, that righteousness that you don't have, that perfection you don't have. We have faith in the perfection of Jesus, the sinlessness of Jesus. And so when we take that bread, we're remembering we're not perfect, he's perfect, and our faith in him imputes that righteousness to us. So when we stand before God because of Jesus, I'm seen as clean. So when I think about my relationship between me and God, I am seen as perfectly righteous. Not because I'm looking at my life, because I'm looking at the life of Jesus. Yes, I remember now. We take the juice to remember the blood shed on the cross. It was the atonement for our sins, and it's all sufficient. And so I remember that my sins have been washed away. They've been paid for. It's not that all my sins, like I got away with it. All my sins were punished. It's just that my punishment was given to Jesus on the cross. He took my punishment, and I get his righteousness. Oh, man, that's right. That's why I am right with God right now, despite all of this sin that I'm feeling as I live in this world. That's why I'm right with God. That strengthens us in a way that it picks us up off the ground. It gets us back up on our feet again, and we can go back into this world, and then next week we'll come back and we'll remember again. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for these moments in Scripture, and we thank you for the rebukes in Scripture. When we think of harsh rebukes, Lord, we're prone to think that they're always mean and unloving, but Lord, this is the most loving thing you could do, is rebuke your disciples in this way. Lord, because we need to read about it here today and be rebuked in the same way. Lord, so often we're just not remembering well. Lord, I pray for those who came here this morning and they're just hanging on by a thread. Lord, I pray that they would remember well as they take the bread and the juice and remember your gospel that saves us. I just pray that your Spirit would just transform how they're thinking and strengthen them, just that their faith would just be bolstered right now, and that they would press in to these truths that we need to keep coming back to, rather than keep going back to the leaven of the Pharisees. Rather than keep going back to that well that causes dehydration, Lord, help us to come to this well that is an eternal fountain, Lord, that gives us life. Lord, bless us right now. Lord, I pray for those who are coming in here with strong faith today, Lord, that you would nourish them. Lord, we need nourishment no matter where we are at. So, Lord, we ask these things in your name for your glory. And it's in your name, Jesus, we pray.